Okay, so here's our last lesson for the unit. This is lesson 8, Inequalities, absolute value with graphing and interval notation. So this is on page 19 of your packet, and let's get started. So here we go. What changes with absolute value? So when we have an inequality like we were solving in the last section, we just solve for the inequality in graph. When we have an absolute value inequality, we split it in the inequality into two, and we're actually solving two different equations, just like when we would split the absolute value into two and solve two different equations. So to combine absolute value, here's the steps. Here's the 5 steps, okay? So the first thing is we're going to isolate the absolute value, which means get it alone on one side of the equation. Then we're going to set up two versions. So version A, so remember when we isolate the absolute value, absolute value equals 5 or something. Remember we would split it up into two. Well, this time pretend it was greater than or equal to 5. We would set it up into two versions. So version A would be change nothing. So we would still have, except the absolute value would go away. So let's just pretend we have x plus 2. Okay, so we would have x plus 2 is greater than or equal to 5. That would be one version. The second, B, says change the sign and the symbol. The symbol part means we're going to flip the inequality sign. So watch what we do. See the x plus 2 here? That stays the same. Remember, we never touch the inside of the absolute value. But this now is going to be less than or equal to instead of greater than or equal to. That's the symbol part. And then the sign, instead of a positive 5, it's a negative 5. So two things change here on the other equation. This sign flips, and instead of a positive, it's a negative. And then we solve. Okay, so that would be an example there. Number 3 says solve and check. 4 is graph, 5 interval notation. With and, it's called an intersection. And with or, it's a union. Okay, and this is the symbol we used for and this is the symbol we use for or, and I'm going to explain that. We actually don't need to use this symbol in our interval because it all goes together, but we're going to be using this union symbol, and I'm going to explain that to you when we do an example. So recall what to do when you divide an inequality by a negative. You're going to flip that sign. Okay, so that's just a reminder. So let's take a look at this example. I'm going to erase this part that I added here, so that way we can follow the steps here. So remember, the first step is to get the absolute value alone. So we're going to get this all by itself. So the first step is to add 4. This cancels, and now we have x plus 2 is greater than 14 plus 4 is 18. Now this absolute value is isolated. There's nothing before it, and there's nothing after it. Remember here, we always look after and we see there's a negative 4, so we need to move it to the other side. Now that was step number 1. Step 2 says set up two versions. The first one, you're going to change nothing, and the second one, you're going to change the sign and the symbol. So here we go. We're going to set up two versions. So the first one is going to be x plus 2 is greater than 18. So we changed nothing. And the other one is x plus 2 is less than negative 18. And then we're going to solve for x. So subtract 2. And then x is greater than 16. That's one of my answers. Subtract 2. Cross this off, and x is less than negative 20. Okay, so now we're going to graph it, and then we'll write it in interval notation. Okay, so we have, I'm going to draw out a graph here. Now, do the least value first, obviously, because it's a number line, so negative 20, and then 16 will be somewhere over here. Remember, you don't need to do everything in between. And you're actually going to be graphing both of these on the same graph, but let's do one at a time. So I'm going to do this one first. X is greater than 16. Well, let's take a look at what this is. Remember that chart on your last notes? How the greater than sign, if there's no equal to, it's an open circle. So I'm going to do an open circle on 16. open circle. And this sign tells me to point to the right. Okay, now I'm going to do an open circle on 20, and this sign tells me to point, or sorry, negative 20, and it tells me to point to the left. Okay, do you see how they never touch? They're going in two opposite directions. When they go in two opposite directions, it's called OR. So when one goes like this and one goes like this, that's OR. When you have a graph that looks like this. So this is when we're going to take advantage of that sign, that union sign. So when we write our interval, we're going to do two separate pieces. We're going to do this one first, and then we're going to do this one, and we're going to put a U in between. So let's just write underneath it, or actually on top of it, since I have more room. Remember when an arrow is pointing to the left, it means infinity, but left means negative. And remember when it points to the right, it's a positive infinity. And then I have a negative 20, and I have a 16. Remember? And then we just put a comma in between them. So we actually just figured out both of our intervals. That was easy. So I'm going to write them both down here, negative infinity, comma, negative 20. Remember, infinity and negative infinity always get a parenthesis. And since this is an open circle right here and right here, both of the numbers are also going to get a parenthesis. So 16, comma, infinity. What you put in between is that U sign. That just means or. So that means it can go from negative infinity to negative 20 or from 16 to infinity. All right, let's take a look at number 2. So on number 2, do you see how this whole side is being divided by 4? We cannot touch the top. We cannot touch the top until we get rid of that divided by 4. What's divided by 4? Not what's divided by 4. What's the opposite of divided by 4? Multiplying by 4. So we're going to multiply both sides by 4 so that we can get that absolute value alone here. So that cancels out, and we have absolute value of x minus 3 is less than or equal to 1 times 4 is 4. Do you see how the absolute value is alone? Now we're going to split it off into 2. And then we have x minus 3. Remember, A says keep 1 the same. B says flip the sign, the inequality sign, and make that 4 a negative 4. And then we're going to solve for x. So add 3 to both sides. So x is less than or equal to 7. Add 3 to both sides. X is greater than or equal to negative 1. Okay, so I'm going to draw a graph here. Negative 1 is the smallest, so I'm going to put that one on the left. 7 is the greatest, so I'm going to put that on the right. And then I'm going to start with, I'll start with this 7. X is less than or equal to 7. So remember that equal to sign means closed circle, and it's going to be pointing this way. And then remember at negative 1, because that tells you the arrow goes the other direction, at negative 1, it's a closed circle as well. And this tells you it points to the right forever. Now, do you see how both of those graphs intersect? They intersect here, negative 1, 7. Do you see how the purple and the red lines meet in the middle? That's the only part of the graph we're going to draw. So I'm going to draw a point at negative 1 and a point at 7, and they meet right here in the middle. So this is my graph. Okay, when they touch like this, this is going to be your answer every time. When they don't touch, like over here, and they go in opposite directions, you're going to have two separate intervals with a U in the middle, which just means union. And now for this one, we actually did this one last time when we did some examples in the last notes. So I'm going to write negative 1 and 7. Notice we don't have an arrow in both directions. It's just a 7 and a negative 1, and it stops at either of those points. So we're going to put a comma in between. So it goes from negative 1 to 7. And remember, closed circles get brackets. So it's going to look like this. And that's it. That's your final answer for the interval.